Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. It's our first show of August and we're kicking off the broadcast with a really big story. It's no secret that this has been a tumultuous year for agriculture in the state. Many are still recovering from the effects of the Springs bomb cyclone and subsequent flooding. Now a new problem is threatening over 107,000 acres in Wyoming and the Nebraska Panhandle. Market Journal's Bill Dodd was out in Western Nebraska and has more.
That's right, Troy. Officials at the local, state, and federal level are all mobilizing in response to the collapse of an irrigation canal tunnel in Goshen County, Wyoming that occurred on July 17th. Now in that area, a 2,200-foot canal tunnel that carries water from the North Platte River to producers in eastern Wyoming and western Nebraska was abruptly cut off after the collapse began to flood surrounding farmland. And in the peak of the summer growing season, when irrigation is most needed, the situation prompted the governors of both states to issue an emergency declaration for the disastrous collapse that is now affecting over 100,000 acres of cropland. Meanwhile, farmers and landowners attended a meeting at the Nebraska Extension Panhandle Research Center in Scottsbluff to find out exactly what happened, what their options are, and how this disaster is being addressed.
Father, we come before you now with concern in our hearts for the things that are going on in our valley. Father, we stand before you and bow before you knowing that you are in control of all things. We understand that there is a time for everything. There's a time to plant, a time to harvest, a time to cultivate, a time to water.
It all began with a prayer. A crisis in Nebraska's Panhandle and several of Wyoming's eastern counties that cut off irrigation for multiple agricultural producers is now threatening entire crops. The irrigation tunnel collapse is currently being viewed as an act of God, though there is no official cause for the collapse. This prompted a public meeting last week at the University of Nebraska Panhandle Research and Extension Center to inform farmers and landowners of what is currently known about the collapse, how it occurred, and what's happening in the response effort. While recovery efforts were currently underway at the time, the cause and solutions were still a bit elusive to some officials at the helm.
At present, we've talked to engineers as pure speculation. We do not know exactly what the cause of it was.
Yeah, this is a really interesting situation. The canal system here was built by the Bureau of Reclamation in the early 1900s. And then those canals are maintained by local irrigation districts. And there are two districts that are responsible for this tunnel. And so as we were looking at a structure of its age and the extremely wet weather events that we've had this year, that makes it really difficult to pinpoint a cause and then who's responsible for this canal break.
Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts announced last Friday, "Our farmers in western Nebraska have lost access to water at a critical time in the growing season. Since the canal failure, I've been in frequent communication with Wyoming Governor Gordon, Senator Erdman, and Senator Stinner about the situation both personally and through my staff and Director of Natural Resources. Today, I have issued a disaster declaration in response to the significant hardship as we work together to get our farmers and ranchers the help they need. For now, crews are virtually working around the clock in order to get water flowing again. Officials are currently aiming for a 20-day target to resolve the situation. In the meantime, producers are holding out hope for measurable rainfall and favorable weather conditions over the coming days, as now is a crucial time for the crops to be irrigated, and with farmers' livelihoods on the line, it can't come soon enough." Nebraska Extension Irrigation Management Specialist Xin Xiao explained to me just how crops could be affected by this disaster.
So for corn and beans, I don't think it's too optimistic. They are at their critical growth stage. Corn is at their reproductive stage from V12 to blister. So this is a stage they need most water. Same thing for dry edible beans. They're about to flowering, and some they already are. Again, they need water at this stage. So if it's really stressed at this point, and for next few weeks, corn will be a total loss, and there might be some left on the beans. And for sugar beets, that's probably the most optimistic crop in this situation.
While authorities are trying to get a fix in place, producers are scrambling to figure out alternative solutions to get water on their crops. Unfortunately, on both counts, there are a litany of legal hoops to jump through, as well as agencies to notify at varying levels of government. While discussing the cost and procedures of fixing the situation, Rick Preston, general manager of Gering-Fort Laramie Irrigation District, described himself as a bull in a china shop, eager to get in, tear down, and rebuild as fast as possible, and at the same time articulated the frustrations that come with a situation like this.
The first 2 or 3 days, we were in an aggressive mode to start putting it back together, to do whatever was necessary to get the system up and running again. And after about the 3rd day, we started having to deal with laws, statutes, channels to have to go through. And after about the 5th day, I was ready to yank anybody that opened their mouth up, to yank their lips off. It is a very, very frustrating, very irritating law when you're in a hurry to try to save the livelihood of individuals. But regardless of nevertheless, you have to back up and take a breath and readdress it in a manner that's civil and level-headed. So,
as of now, as we mentioned earlier, crews are working around the clock to get a temporary solution in place while a permanent fix is being worked out. The final price tag on the project is estimated to cost upward of $10 million. As far as where the money will come from and how insurance deals with the affected farmers and landowners is still up in the air pending an investigation into the cause of the collapse. That investigation will commence just as soon as crews have water running again. Until then, many producers and officials are in a hurry-up-and-wait mode as they continue to work as fast as they can to ensure producers in the area have a little peace of mind. Now, if you're looking for information on the tunnel collapse, you can visit go.unl.edu/canal. And this is a joint venture between Nebraska and Wyoming Extension Networks aimed at getting you the most current information on the situation. We'd also like to note if you're in need of resources such as access to attorneys, financial advisors, or counselors in this time of need, you can reach out to the Rural Response Hotline at 800-464-0258 and be sure to ask about the no-cost vouchers for counseling services. Now, we'll be sure to keep our eye on this developing story, but for now, I'll send it back to you, Troy.
Thanks, Bill. Great reporting on that. We're going to continue our coverage of this irrigation disaster in today's market segment with North Dakota State University crop economist, Dr. Frayne Olson. We've got some other topics we want to get to as well. And Frayne, we just heard Bill say the canal collapse is impacting over 100,000 acres of farmland. Do you have any insight as to what that might mean for the market and the decisions those producers need to make?
Well, from an overall global marketing standpoint, it's probably not going to have a huge impact on futures market prices. The more challenge will be what's going to happen locally. And again, not knowing the exact split by crop, I suspect there's going to be, because it's irrigated, will be a lot of corn, maybe some soybeans, some alfalfa. Again, on the futures market side, it probably won't have a huge impact, but locally it will, which really means that there's going to be an impact or adjustment in the basis levels. Now, the other thing we need to think about is how much will the basis adjust, and that adjustment typically depends upon how large an area has been impacted. From my indications from talking to folks in Nebraska, it sounds like over a large portion of the state, the corn and soybean crop, even though it's a bit delayed, really does look very good. I know there's pockets where it does not, but in general, the crop in Nebraska is looking very good. So in particular, a lot of the grain supply, whether it be, again, corn, soybeans, or alfalfa, will likely be shipped in to backfill what the area losses are. So again, we can make an estimate based on transportation costs what those basis level shifts may be. Again, the challenge will be, how do we try and put a marketing plan together given the lower bushels? And again, that's going to be very, very different across each of the different farmers that are being impacted.
All right, I love that breakdown. So moving on, we've also got information regarding the Market Facilitation Program payments. That information was released. Could you give us a quick refresher on MFP and tell us the important things to remember from this latest announcement?
All right, very good. So the first is the enrollment is now officially open. And what you can do is you can go to farmers.gov to get information about the structure of the MFP program, There's also a downloadable PDF that you can apply for it. You can go to your local FSA office, or you can apply online or use the downloadable forms. The calculations for each of the county payments have already been made. And again, if you go to that farmers.gov, you can click on the link. Now, when you take that acreage and you try and figure out, well, if you make a rough estimate of what's my payment going to be, for all of the covered commodities, for all of the covered crops, you'll get that same rate. So let's say it's $30 an acre in the total payment for your county. You take all of the covered commodities, all of the acres for the crops that you have planted, times that $30, that is the estimate for the total payment. 50% of that will be received in August. So 50% upfront will be received in August. The minimum payment that you will receive in August will be $15 per acre. The other two payments, so the other 50%, will be spread over two additional payments, one in November, one in January. Those payments are not guaranteed, so we'll have to wait to see if the trade agreements are not in place, if there continues to be depressed prices. You will receive these sequential payments. But if we get an agreement relatively quickly and the prices rebound, you may not be allowed to receive those second payments. So the second half of that, the other two payments, one in November, one in January, are optional. So we'll have to wait to see whether those payments are made. The main thing is that to understand that you need to apply for this, you have to fill out the forms, you make sure that your application gets in, and that when you look at that payment rate, 50% of it will come in August, and the other 50% will be optional payments later on in the season.
All right, very good. And Frayne, wheat harvest, that's another big story. And how's that looking, and what are some of the hurdles producers are facing in the market? Any advice for them?
Well, wheat harvest is progressing relatively smoothly. It looks as though Kansas is pretty much finished up. It looks like Colorado is about 75% harvested. Nebraska wheat is about 50% harvested, give or take a little bit. So we're making some progress. When we look at the crop quality samples that are coming in, average protein levels are a little bit lower than what we saw last year, and test weights are also a little bit lower than last year. Yields are quite variable. I know there's areas that are having some really very, very good yield potential. There's some areas that have had some disease pressure where, again, bringing down the test weights and the yields are not as good as we had hoped. The biggest challenge, I think, when talking to at least the wheat farmers up here in North Dakota, is the concern and frustration with the base price. One of the things that I'm watching for specifically in the wheat market is if we start getting some significant rallies in the corn crop or corn prices, the wheat price will have to stay at a premium to corn to prevent it from ending up in the feed pile. And again, we don't want to take that high quality wheat that's typically used for wheat milling and suddenly have to shift it into the feed pile. So as I see it, when prices for corn are low, wheat does its own thing, but as corn prices come up, then all of a sudden the wheat price is also in fact impacted more heavily by corn. So I'm telling the farmers up here, look for some sparks in the corn market that, in my opinion, will be some very good pricing opportunities for wheat as well.
Yeah, lots of tie-in between those two crops for sure. And let's move on to soybeans real quick. What do we need to know here as far as pricing, the market outlook, trade updates, anything you want to tell us?
Yeah, so when we look at the corn and soybean market, right now we're kind of in this lull. August 12th, we're going to get an update or a resurvey of the USDA acreage numbers. We'll also get some better estimates of what prevented planting will be. So a lot of times right now we're kind of in this funny phase where we don't have a real good handle on planted acreage, which we'll get on August 12th. And we're also in this relatively mundane weather conditions. It looks as though weather is going to be fairly favorable for crop development. Even though our crop condition ratings are not as good as last year, they seem to have stabilized. Now, in my opinion, I'm much more concerned about the crop development than I am about crop condition. So the concerns about crop development, about potential frost damage, even if we have normal frost time period, what does that mean for drying costs? What does that mean for yield? What does that mean for test weight? Those are all going to be concerns as we get later into the season. I do think corn prices will be much more variable than soybean prices simply because we have such large carryover stocks of soybeans from last year.
Got it. And finally, Frayne, let's end it today by getting some strategies and ways to manage any risk on corn, soybeans, and wheat. If there's anything at all there you'd like to tell us.
Yeah, the core thing I'm trying to get across to the farmers that I'm talking to is we're going to see extremely volatile prices as we move into the mid part of August and first part of September. And so I think there will be some pricing opportunities, but they're going to be very, very short-lived. We're not going to see this large ramp up in prices. We're going to see a lot of price volatility. And trying to set prices or trying to market crop in that kind of an environment is very difficult. My recommendation is to try and pick some pricing points and put orders in ahead of time. Work with your local elevator, work with a broker, put the pricing points in saying if the cash price or futures price reaches a certain point, try and make some sales at this point and have those sales booked in advance. So let the market come to you instead of trying to chase the market, because typically farmers are not fast enough to chase the market. It just responds too quickly.
Good information as always from Frayne. Next up, Brent Wolf can make agriculture-related applications with airplanes and helicopters, but he prefers being the pilot in command. The Bennington, Nebraska pilot is the owner and operator of Hexagon helicopters. They help farmers seed cover crops into standing crops, along with fertilizer and other applications around the region. Wolf says seeding cover crops is a natural fit for his business. And last year, about 1/3 of his cover crop customers were trying the service for the first time. Read about Wolf's business and how area farmers have used it to incorporate cover crops into their rotation in the August Nebraska Farmer. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, we've made it to August. We've seen a few scattered showers across the state this week and our fair share of sunshine too. What's the latest forecast look like?
Well, Troy, you're absolutely correct. We have seen a variety of weather this last week. The warmest of the temperatures, of course, in western Nebraska, where they were closer to the periphery of the ridge that is built over the southern and central plains. And further east, we had a few days of very cloudy conditions, particularly in the midweek period, as those waves moving around the periphery of the ridge brought a lot of clouds into much of east, central, and northeast Nebraska. And of course, we did see some decent precipitation along the Missouri River, and of course, some precipitation that moved around the ridge that gave us some welcome moisture. Unfortunately, we do have some areas with the latest drought monitor that are showing some abnormally dry conditions, particularly to the north of Omaha and south of basically the Sioux City area, basically around that West Point area. And we have been hearing reports of scattered stress conditions now for the better part of the last 2 to 3 weeks. And a lot of it has to do with some of the younger and later planted crops that just didn't have the root structure to pull up the moisture and compensate for the warmer temperatures. Now, as we go forward in time, one of the biggest concerns as we go into the month of August is, are we going to catch up on some of the cool conditions from May? And right now, the models are kind of all over the place in regards to temperatures, depending on who you look at or what you look at, anywhere from abnormally cool conditions to basically normal type temperatures. We are basically going to have to still see an above normal September for us to catch up of any amount for those that were especially late in terms of their planting, and that would be that last week of May through the first 2 weeks of June. So as we go to the upper air model, we still have that high pressure in place right over the central Rockies. Systems moving around the periphery of this ridge, bringing moisture into our region. We have high pressure at the surface to the east of us. That counterclockwise flow is allowing a little southeast winds at the surface. We've got a low pressure down in Texas that'll pull moisture up. So we are going to be dealing with yet another wave that'll be moving around the periphery of this ridge over the next 24 hours, targeting northeast and east central Nebraska as it moves down the Missouri River Valley. As we go into tomorrow, we still see high pressure aloft. We've got low pressure stacked up to our west. Once again, we'll start to see some moisture moving around there. It looks like the best opportunity for good precipitation tomorrow. We'll start out in the Black Hills, and then we'll start to see that sliding toward the southeast, particularly during the overnight hours into eastern Nebraska. Monday morning, we're looking at a low pressure system basically at the surface in northwestern Kansas, high pressure in southeastern or southwestern Missouri. That's going to allow moisture to feed around the periphery of that ridge. And once again, we'll see another wave moving down through eastern Nebraska, bringing in scattered thunderstorm activity. On Tuesday, we see that ridge still pretty much in the same place with a northwest flow over eastern Nebraska, high pressure to our west, that we're still probably going to be looking at another wave moving into eastern Nebraska during the overnight hours and the morning hours, and that will progress to the east. And then we do see some signs of maybe potentially flattening out this ridge somewhat as the heat kind of pushes back toward the southwest. We have thermal low basically sitting over the southern panhandle. There is a moisture feed, but it doesn't look like we've got a lot of convergence. So this looks like probably the best of the driest during this next few days in terms of precipitation. And then the ridge thinks it wants to build back into the eastern part of the state as we go into Thursday. Another low pressure tries to develop over the Texas panhandle, allow some moisture to build up. So once again, another wave will move around the periphery of this ridge and target eastern Nebraska with some scattered thunderstorm activity. And then we see this ridge starting to build toward the north and expanding the heat into the South Dakota and eastern Nebraska. Once again, low pressure sitting over southwestern Kansas will allow moisture to feed in the low-level jet northward. And once again, systems will move around the periphery of this ridge, so we do have another chance for scattered thunderstorm activity. As we go further in time, it looks like that ridge will hold through next weekend before we start to see signs of it breaking down somewhat, bringing a zonal flow. So the cool temperatures remain to our north and to our east. And in terms of precipitation, with that northwest flow, numerous waves moving into southeast, given above normal chances for heavy precipitation across eastern Nebraska and northwestern Nebraska. So Troy, it looks like scattered thunderstorm activity is in the cards. Temperatures are a little bit up and down over this next 7-day period.
Thanks, Al. For farmers in the state, the annual Soybean Management Field Days are a summer tradition. This is the 21st year for the event. Like in the past, the Soybean Management Field Days will offer unbiased, research-based information and address the local and international issues important to soybean farmers.
No matter what industry you're in, what business you're in, I think it's very important that you have a good understanding of what you're working with. And you know, new research is developing new tools at a very fast rate. And the old scheme of planting and growing soybeans is probably a bit different today than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 2 decades ago. So I think it's very important growers stay on top of latest production practices that are being suggested by the university scientists. We are validating, in many instances, what maybe they're also seeing in the fields. And hopefully one of the take-home messages is that they need to stay abreast of changes in the world of soybean production.
And Keith says a lot of the research this year relates to cover crops, with the goal of understanding how particular varieties will impact soybeans.
We have a lot of interest now in cover crops, and the questions are, you know, do cover crops impact soybean yield? Do cover crops influence weed control? Do cover crops influence insect pressure? So we're evaluating, as an example, those items, and we're looking at 2 cover crops, and those were wheat, winter wheat, and then also cereal rye. And of course we have a check where we have no cover crops.
You're invited to attend one of the 4 Soybean Management Field Days. They'll take place over 4 consecutive days, beginning on August 13th in Sargent, before moving on to Pilger, Plymouth, and Waverly. Registration starts at 9 a.m. each day. There's no cost for the event, and lunch will be provided. You can find out more on our website. That's marketjournal.unl.edu. Ending our show today, imagine yourself taking a sip of a sweet summer wine on the deck of a countryside vineyard. In order to make this dream a reality, you don't have to go to the West Coast. Wineries are popping up in Nebraska too. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh recently attended a workshop at Soaring Wings Vineyard near Springfield, Nebraska, to learn what Nebraska Viticulture is bringing to the wine industry.
What may come as a surprise to many is the fact that Nebraska is the proud home of more than 40 wineries and tasting rooms. With the harsh winters the state is known for, picking the right cultivar becomes crucial to the operation. That's why UNL Professor of Viticulture, Dr. Paul Reed, researches and provides advice to those who need it.
We actually have tested between the numbered selections from breeders and actual varieties or cultivars. We've tested almost 100 grapes, different types, to be able to say to a potential grower, nope, this doesn't grow well here. They can benefit from our research by being advised in positive and negative ways. It's positive really to give them the negative information. We also always tell a potential grower if they're thinking of growing significant amount of grapes that they need to do a good business plan and think through what they're going to do with those grapes. There's no sense in growing something like Concord if no winery wants to buy it.
When it comes to problems such as pests and disease, Paul is a firm believer in on-site teaching and first-hand experience.
This trunk disease is something that you have to see to believe it. When you start cutting vines down, which otherwise might have been producing grapes for this, in this case, this winery, it tells you something very profound, that these vines have this disease, and it's a complex of several fungal diseases that are affecting grapevines worldwide. So we're teaching some remedial measures like growing new trunks. It can be done, and we are now demonstrating that in some of our research vineyards.
And at the end of the day, Paul says the principle of growing grapes is no different than any other crop.
Something I like to say to potential growers, this is agriculture. It's a different kind of agriculture, and it is, like all agriculture, risky, but with risk comes reward, and there's nothing wrong with being able to sit on your veranda and prop your feet up and sip a glass of nice Nebraska wine.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
If you're interested in learning more about Nebraska viticulture, there's still one more tailgate this year. Experts will be at Cellar 426 Wines and Vines in Ashland, Nebraska on August 7th from 4 p.m. until dark. They'll answer any questions and provide expertise on anything viticulture. We've got more information on the Market Journal website. That's a wrap for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Next week, the weather this past winter caused stress on cattle across the state, and as a result, many calves received lower quality colostrum, making them weaker and at risk for issues like summer pneumonia. Here's some signs to look out for. And we'll offer some management decisions regarding soybean gall midge. That and a whole lot more. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Frayne Olson. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.